Welcome to Our Social Impact. This is Dirk Van Velzen, and I'm Executive Director of the Prison Scholar Fund, where we have a mission of providing education and employment assistance to help incarcerated people succeed and thrive in society while avoiding homelessness and the revolving door of incarceration. Today we have Brent Orrell, the resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute.
I've admired the work of I had admired the work of AEI for many years. I had been in DC for about 30 years, including 14 on Capitol Hill and 8 in the George W. Bush administration, and then I was a consultant. And I'd always followed the Institute's work very closely, really liked it, and the opportunity came up that they were looking for somebody who knew something about workforce development, which is part of my background, and somebody who knew something about prisoner reentry, which I also knew something about. I wouldn't claim to be an expert in the sense that I don't have a PhD. I haven't run studies, randomized controlled trial studies of either workforce development or prisoner reentry, but I do have a strong interest in it, and I spent a lot of time working on it.
Is it resident scholar? I mean, you're there full time?
Yeah, I'm at AEI full time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you go there under the workforce development angle and then became criminal justice reform?
It was really both. They were looking for a scholar to replace another really good guy, Dirk Van Velzen, who had been at AEI for a couple of years. And he had spun off his own nonprofit work that he was going to do in education, so they needed somebody to work on that issue. They also, AEI had also, especially over the last 5 years or so, really gotten into the workforce space because it's so critical to economic mobility and some of the challenges that we're facing as a country of people not having access to good family-sustaining jobs. So I care about both of those things. I worked in both of those things, and so that's how I wound up there.
Yeah, you guys are all over the place because I met Gerard. I think I met him in Denver in one of your Bridging Divide summers,
Right.
and I met him about a month after that in DC.
Mm-hmm.
He was hosting a briefing for bring the Pell Grant back.
Yeah, he's and we're part of that coalition of organizations. Actually, AEI as an organization doesn't take positions on issues. Only scholars take positions on issues. But so that's Gerard is an important part of that effort that's going on in DC to try to change the law around Pell Grants for prisoners.
And did you continue some of the work he developed, or did you come with your own agendas to work on?
I think it's always everybody brings their own kind of angle on this. My angle, I can't really speak too much to sort of Gerard's angle, although I will say that he's gone into education work after he left AEI. So I think that's like where his main interest is, and I know he came out of education policy. So I come out of workforce policy and poverty policy. So those are kind of the way that I take on the issue. I'm really interested in what we know about and what we can do about the conditions that give rise to communities that give rise to communities experiencing a high impact from people returning from prison. My own introduction to the issue, I really didn't know very much about reentry. I was working on Capitol Hill. I came to the Labor Department. It was right before 9/11 happened. And so before we could even really get started on anything, there was 9/11, and that emergency sort of took over everything that was happening. And I used that as an opportunity to go out and try to get my hands around what was going on in the United States, meeting with community leaders and people who lead organizations like yours, actually. And the issue that kept coming up over and over again was this thing called reentry. Reentry was a big problem where community leaders saying to me, well, we're knitting as fast as we can here, trying to hold this community together. And we're being inundated by people coming home from prison, and they are undoing our work. They're unraveling faster than we can knit, and we really need something to break that cycle. So what they told me was that employment was a huge issue. For people coming home from prison, that was no one had really made much progress on the ban the box issue. There was a lot of actual and perceived discrimination against people who had criminal records. And so while other people were over here kind of working on the let's change the law side, I was like, okay, what can we do on the other side? How can we better support the people who are trying to make this transition? We're Republicans. We have access to employers. Maybe they'll listen to us. Maybe they will be more willing to engage if it's a Republican administration talking to them rather than a Democratic administration. So we had some focus groups with employers to try to get them to talk a little bit about what it was that was the main obstacle to them hiring people with criminal records. And what we found, we would sit down with them and, okay, we get it. This is a risk, right, for you to hire somebody who's been in prison. If an employer knowingly hires somebody with a felony record, and that person commits another crime, say against another employee or against a customer, it's a huge liability issue for them. And that's what it turned out. That's what it was. It wasn't that they didn't want to be good citizens. They didn't want to, extend an opportunity to people who are trying to restart their lives. They were completely into all of that, but the liability issues were really creating a big problem for them. So, how do you deal with that?
Right? How do you deal with that?
Yeah. So
I know there's those tax incentives.
Well, that was already in existence when I arrived on the scene, and things like the federal bonding program were also available. But when we asked employers about those incentives, what they said to us was, those are really not the place to start the conversation. To say to somebody, we will pay you to hire this person, immediately kind of
that doesn't change the risk picture.
Yeah, it doesn't change the risk picture, and it sets off this kind of alarm bell. And then you say, here's this special insurance that I've got.
We know it's going to be risky. So here's some things to mitigate it.
Yeah, and it's risky, and we're reminding you of how risky it is.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so those programs were not very appealing on their own to employers, right? So what we proposed as an alternative was, what if somebody coming home from prison came to you via a community organization? An organization that was that specialized in dealing with all of the non-work related barriers that people coming home from prison have, right? They're going to help with transportation, they're going to help with the housing, they're going to help with the referrals to substance abuse, mental health, or whatever it is that somebody coming home from prison might need. And the needs are often quite extensive, as you know. So what you could see in those focus groups is when you started introducing those ideas, the anxiety levels began to fall. It's like, well, what it was that when you come home from prison, you've been in prison, you've broken faith with everybody. If you've gone to prison, you've broken faith with your family, and you've broken faith with the community, with business, with schools. Everybody has had enough of you, right? Right. So
a lot of times more than once.
Yeah. So to have an organization say, look, we're working with this person. They've made a change. They want to do right by themselves, by their families, by the community, by your business. And then the person is no longer just this free radical, completely isolated on their own.
in this example, you might have people that join those programs that want to change their lives, which would be a different person than the one that doesn't join the program,
Right.
which would be the one that's really maybe needs the help.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of help the highest risk group that's probably most likely to reoffend? Because maybe the people joining those programs, they're kind of already got their head on straight,
Yeah.
and they might not reoffend.
Right. So there's a huge issue. There's always a big issue of selection bias in these programs.
So people are messy. Like, how do you
Right.
account for the selection bias?
Right. Well, typically what you do to account for selection bias is use randomized assignment. So you take a group of people and you divide them in half. They're roughly the same types of people. Maybe they've committed similar types of crimes. Maybe they kind of, to the naked eye or to the research eye, kind of look like similarly risky. Similar levels of risk, and you divide them up, and half of the people get the program, and the other half don't get the program, and then you compare their outcomes, and you decide, did the intervention make any difference? We didn't do that because we didn't have the resources for a randomized control trial. We just wanted to see if maybe this might be helpful, and it looked pretty good the first few years. We saw substantially lower rates of reoffending among people taking part in this than kind of the general world, but we weren't doing a control trial, so we couldn't say.
Just evaluating the data.
Yeah, it's just program data. We're just looking for it. It looks pretty good for the first couple of years, and then the further out that you get, the lower the positives were. Everything sort of reverted to the mean, even in this sort of bias sample.
You're not breaking the cycle.
Even for people that were relatively maybe more motivated, still wasn't working.
So they're doing okay for a couple of years, and just kind of fall back to old patterns.
Yeah, and even in randomized control trials where there's a fade out in terms of the impact over time, and that even more kind of challenging from my perspective is that it's possible to make the case that the control groups, people who don't receive services in these randomized control trials, are doing about as well and maybe even a little bit better than the people who get services.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So what happens there?
So, and this is kind of the direction that my work at AEI has taken around this issue, which is we don't know whether that's some sort of weird artifact of the research, whether it's an actual thing that we need to pay attention to. But the pattern is consistent enough that we at least need to take it into consideration. Like, is there something that we're doing that is actually making the problem worse for some people?
So almost like the Hawthorne effect, just like studying them makes them misbehave, or
possibly the Hawthorne effect, or it could be that, and this is kind of the intuition that I'm working off right now, is maybe we're not, maybe we don't know as much as we need to know, and maybe it's not possible to know enough to really help people based on their individual circumstances through kind of a centralized program. What if we took a different approach that really tried to leverage people who are returning from prison, leverage their own capacity to sort of understand their own lives and make decisions about their own lives.
So what would that look like?
Okay, so good question.
Well, before we get there, too, like, what kind of studies did you evaluate? Was like an analysis, and you reviewed a lot of other existing
So we assembled a working group of researchers. We're going to be issuing a report here in the next month on sort of what that working group, what that conversation was like. We actually didn't come to a consensus on what we ought to do about this, but we assembled these researchers, people who had worked for decades in mostly PhD, social scientists, economists, people who worked around this issue, studied a lot of programs. And so we we brought them together and we kind of talked this through. And so that insight that I mentioned about like the control groups doing as well, and sometimes a little bit better than the treatment groups, came from a researcher who's been doing this for like 35 years, and she studied the SVORI program, the Serious and Violent Offender Initiative out of the Department of Justice from the 1990s. She studied a number of other major reentry initiatives, and she's the one who brought this forward and said, this is really a challenge to us, that not only are we not helping, it looks like we may be getting in the way a little bit for some people in terms of their ability to successfully transition.
Huh.
So there was a lot of silence in the room around that conversation.
Yeah, because it seems like there's tons of data that does support some things work.
Yeah.
And it's almost like you could probably have a big data battle to see whose data, which data set you're looking at, which programs you're evaluating.
Right.
Is it education, transition?
Right. Yeah. Right. So like the data around education, the RAND study is probably the best thing out there. There's data around case management for some populations seems to make a difference. Cognitive behavioral therapy, especially if you live in Sweden or Norway, seems to make a big difference. That's where most of those studies are.
It's funny because if you want to compare it for those Norwegian or the Scandinavian countries, the culture is so different.
Yeah.
I was talking we have a Google volunteer, and he's from the Netherlands, and he was saying the reason that homelessness doesn't really exist in Sweden, for example, is because if you're homeless, people will run up to you and say, "What is going on? What is wrong with you? Let's help." It's a totally different social fabric of people supporting each other.
So there's a famous anecdote from Milton Friedman, the conservative economist, and he was meeting with the Prime Minister of Sweden many years ago. I don't even know who the Prime Minister was, but they were talking about the issue of poverty, and the Swedish Prime Minister said, "Well, that in Sweden we don't really have poverty, and Friedman responded, "Yes, we've noticed that among Swedes in America too. They aren't poor. Like there's something in the culture of Sweden that insulates people against poverty, and some people have traced it back actually just how difficult it was to survive in those communities in the medieval period and later."
Oh, interesting.
Like the work ethic. Everybody
has to be a tight community to survive.
Yeah, you had to be a tight community to survive, and you had to work really hard. So that's why it's like, well, can we really transfer any of that knowledge, based on cultural differences?
And people would also say they have so many support services because they tax them at like 70%. I don't know what the tax rate really is over there.
I was just reading yesterday. I think that I think it's about 80%. Yeah, but you get, you're getting just your whole life paid for basically via government programs. So
you really can't compare that because I don't think that would fly in America.
No, that definitely wouldn't fly. And just to back on the reentry issue, I mean, it's like there aren't that many people in prison in Scandinavian countries, right? So everybody gets their own psychologist, like a dedicated person. Well, it's very intensive treatment of people in prisons. More
of a safety. It's like we see you're here. We want to know why.
We're
here to help you.
Like you're kind of you're an oddity.
Yeah. What happened?
What happened to you? And how can we make it better?
Yeah.
And how can we make you better? Anyway, so you're right. There is something called the What Works literature around reentry, and there are these individual elements of programs that seem to make a difference. Like I said, cognitive behavioral therapy, mentoring, family visits seem to make a difference. If you're visited by your family in prison, those people seem to do better when they get out. Mental health and substance abuse treatment seem to make a difference in terms of reducing recidivism. So there are these individual things, right, that sometimes seem to help some populations. Case management seems to do better with, can't remember whether it's with juveniles. it's either juveniles or adults that seem to show some results around case management. I can't remember which, but the other group doesn't. Okay, so they've got these individual things that sometimes seem to make a difference. What we don't have is evidence of sort of coordinated interventions that that set out with their goal of trying to keep people from coming back from prison, and they're kind of coordinated longitudinal interventions. That there's no evidence around those programs right now that they do better than not doing anything. And that's a problem in the long term, right? It's a little hard to go to the taxpayer and say, keep funding this stuff when we don't have anything that says it's working. Now, some of the folks on our working group say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater on this. There are things that work. We need to keep trying. We need better data. We need more faithful implementation of programs. That's one of the big issues. It's like if you get something that you think works and then you hand it off to somebody, try to get them to do it, you can't get it to replicate.
Yeah.
Right. So because they're not doing it right, or they leave out certain elements, they modify
Yeah,
it.
it's going from someone really passionate about the subject to maybe an administrator.
Yeah, or just like there's somebody who says, well, I think this thing has 4 elements, A, B, C, and D, but we don't really like C. We don't think it works. So we're not going to do C. We're only going to do A, B, and D. And then are you really testing the same thing at that point? You're not testing. You're testing a new model. Well, the new model didn't work, right? So was it because we left C out? Or is there some other confounding factor in that? It's very difficult. Social science research, it's just very difficult to isolate what's going on and really get to the bottom of why it worked here and didn't work there. So the argument for among some of the scholars on our working group was we just need to keep trying. We need to be better about how we implement. We need to collect better or different data, and we need to be more patient. That sometimes you don't see this you don't see the results in the first 3 years. You see them in years 4, 5, and 6. We need to be more realistic about what we can expect out of these programs. We need to define success differently, right? So it's going back. We're saying unless somebody doesn't go back to prison, this has failed. But what if we're lengthening the time between episodes of incarceration? Does that count as success? So that's sort of one side of this argument among our research team, and I'm willing to entertain all of that. We can do better. We can implement more faithfully. We can collect data differently. We can redefine the problem in ways that we can see some positive effects. So I'm totally willing to go down that path. While we're doing that, I'm interested in seeing if there is an alternative that really focuses on building up the capacity of people who are in prisons to make decisions about and guide their own lives, right? Because I always say to people that reentry is a jigsaw puzzle. Reentry is a jigsaw. It's got all sorts of different possible combinations. It's like a Rubik's Cube. And every prisoner has their own puzzle, right? So what works for me might not work for you or that person over there, because they've got something in their lives, some different experience that means that what works for me isn't going to work for them. So what we're going to put out on the table, AEI, me as a scholar, is a proposal that we try to combine the individual elements that we see have positive effects. Case management, cognitive behavioral therapy, substance abuse, mental health services. We try to combine those things into a single pre-release program that would be kind of like what we've seen a little bit on with some of the faith-based work, where you create a Muslim unit or a Christian unit, or transcendental meditation unit, where people go into that unit and they are immersed in that. So we
have a supportive community.
Yeah, a therapeutic, right, a supportive therapeutic community. Everybody's on the same page, pursuing the same philosophy, but we do that with cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT is very effective in helping people with eating disorders and helping people with all kinds of life change issues, with anxiety problems, with all sorts of things. It's effective at helping people develop new coping mechanisms. So let's try it with this population.
Yeah. So kind of one idea might be maybe the programs per se aren't really that effective, but maybe just the attention they're having, the human interaction, the community they're building. And kind of when they have that support while they're incarcerated, that's pretty effective. And then when they get out, you have the fade out.
Yeah.
And then once they're in the harsh realities of the real world, they don't have that community.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a huge factor. I agree completely. That.
If they don't have a family and they don't have friends and they're just by themselves.
Right.
Then what?
Right. So this is part 2 of the project.
Okay. We're gonna hit it.
Yeah. So, what I'd like to see is, in addition to the CBT process that people are going through, at the same time, they're getting coaching to help them map out a plan for what they're going to do once they get out. Like, one element I neglected to mention was we also want to do risk assessments. Like, what is it? What are the things that are really going to trip you up once you get out of here? Is it addiction? Is it lack of community? Is it I've got a serious anger management problem, or I've got a substance abuse problem? These are the things that are likely to get in the way of a successful transition. So you kind of identify those while you're going through the CBT process. And then you've got a coach that's helping you design a plan, but it's really your design. It's the prisoner's design. This is what I think will make the biggest difference for me.
They take some ownership in crafting their future.
Right, because I think that for many people who have been in prison, not all certainly, but many who have been in prison, they've been subject to government interventions for a long time. And people have really, it may have started out with Child Protective Services when they were kids, and then progressed to the public school system, trying to do stuff to address these emerging problems. Then there was juvenile justice, trying to divert kids away from criminal activity. Really, prison is just society's last line of, we don't know what else to do with you. So you've got this coach that's working with you, developing your reentry, working with you, you're developing your reentry plan, you've got ownership, you are maybe, this is one of the few times in your life where somebody has said to you, you're really in charge of this. We can't really do it for you. We've tried intervening with you. And that's maybe led you to the conclusion that somebody's always going to be there trying to prevent you from doing something that's damaging to yourself, self-harming. Now you have to step up, you have to own this, you have to make it it's got to be your plan. All right, so you develop this, I own this is my plan, this is what I'm going to do. Combine that in this construct that I'm trying to develop, you combine that with a voucher that can be used to address the issues in your plan, right? So you have your plan, you have your voucher, and then you probably need a directory of services, right? So here are the organizations in the community that provide the kinds of services that you might be interested in going to, but you have to go choose. You have to go shop for who it is that you want to help you.
And it kind of fills the safety net of, when I got released, I had a family, I had a dad, I had close, people I had support. So this would be like, if they have no support,
Right.
it's kind of filling the gap of,
maybe I'm going to use my voucher for training at the local community college to get a credential in something. Or
so it's really individualized.
Yeah,
really
it's very self-directed, right? Now, obviously you have to have somebody signing off on that. It's not a credit card that you can just go and blow on whatever you want.
You can see all sorts of trouble there.
Yeah. So you've got to have some accountability.
It's on the black market real fast.
Yeah. You've got to have some accountability. The money doesn't get released until you've got your coaches sign off that this is legitimate expense.
Some kind of case manager to monitor this process.
Yeah. But and that case manager should also be there when that person hits the snag, and says, God, I'm really frustrated. I can't find the thing that I need, or I've got this other issue I didn't really anticipate. What should I do? So you've got somebody to kind of bounce that stuff off of.
And that's actually a unique relationship between the returning citizen and the case manager, because a lot of times the way that's structured now is it's almost like a gotcha. They're just waiting for that one person to slip up so they throw them back in prison, as opposed to maybe a partnership for success.
Yeah.
How do they really work together to build that trust to let them know that we're here for you?
Yeah, exactly. And I think a very important element of this is that this isn't just something that's happening. It's not just the prison system and the guards and the administrators in the prison that need to be involved. It's also the people in the probation system, parole system that need to understand who they're working with, because they've heard every story 1,000 times. Very, got a hard shell from a lot of disappointment, but they need to be part of this. Say, all right, this person has this background, they've been prepared in this way. These are the tools this is an additional tool that you as a reentry official have to work with. So they need to be brought into this continuum as well.
There'd have to be a lot of training involved, because as soon as one person confirms their bias, they're going to say, see, we told you guys more, therefore we're not going to be a partner in this.
Right. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. I really and a lot of empathy for the people who work in prisons.
If you can imagine, if your career is 20 years being lied to on a daily basis, you're not going to be very sympathetic.
Yeah.
So it'd be an interesting person that can be a human after all of that.
And I think that one of the things I like that I would like to see in the CBT approach is that it's not just the prisoners and the therapists who are engaged in this, but it's really everybody who's touching those people in the prison system as well. They're being brought into this therapeutic community as well, because frankly, they're subject to a lot of secondary trauma. They're seeing a lot of bad things happening, and I have compassion for that, as well as the people who are trying to get their lives straightened out. We're doing a lot of damage to people in prison, and some of the people who are being damaged by it are actually the people who work there. So trying to incorporate everybody into this therapeutic community, I think, is important.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting perspective.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you saw it. I'm sure you've heard about it. What does it mean for somebody to show up to work every day to see some really bad behavior on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, it's funny. There's also this really weird dynamic between the prisoners and the guards. And once some of the prisoners, they realize that they have more in common with the guards than the guards really want to let on, because the guards are really the lowest level of the criminal justice pyramid. They have the people at the top, but the guards really have to follow order from everybody else. And so the guards really, their only response is they get to kick the people right below them, which are the prisoners. But the prisoners know that. And so when the guards say something like, hey, well, I get to go home, they'll kind of taunt the prisoner with that I get to go home statement. But the prisoner will come back and say, hey, how many more years do you have until retirement? I'm going home next year. It's like a lot of prison guards, they're doing 20 years to get their retirement. And everyone realizes prison sucks, whether you're an inmate doing a year or two and you go home, or if you're a prison guard and you're doing 20 years, you're spending 8 hours a day in an environment that's terrible with people that don't like you.
Right.
And even your supervisors probably don't like you too much. So it's an interesting.
And what medicine and psychology tell us about what happens to people who are exposed to that chronically?
Yeah.
It's not good. The report on the Alabama prison system that came out a few months ago, just shockingly terrible conditions. One of those things, not the most important thing, but one of the things that the report found were people who were working, stories of guards falling asleep on their feet because they're working so much overtime because Alabama won't hire more guards because those guards are long-term expenses to the state of Alabama. You got to fund retirements and healthcare and all of that. So they don't want to hire any more people. Meanwhile, the prison population is huge. Anyway, I think we need to have compassion for people in prison, and that includes the people who work there, because I think they're really being traumatized by that experience.
Who's the guy that just died? Epstein?
Epstein, yeah.
I think the response from the federal prison system was like, hey, our guys are working 60, 70 hours a week.
Yeah.
They don't have the capacity to
Yeah.
monitor everybody all the time.
Yeah. The end of all of this is, and this is what I'm advocating for, is that, so I've articulated a different kind of approach. I think it's got a lot of problems, potential problems in it. We know that the existing system it's also got a lot of problems in it.
There's lots of room for improvement.
Lots of room for improvement but what I think we need is experimentation. We know that what we're doing isn't working, so we've got to try something new, and it's got to be kind of outside the box that we're used to working in, and that's why I want to focus on this agency question, personal agency. Can we do anything around that? And we're about to get into a project with Rand Corporation, actually, looking at how we might be able to apply some of what we've learned out of the behavioral health world and apply it in the prisons and prison setting. Like, how do you change diet? How do you change exercise behaviors? We've learned a lot about that. Can we apply any of that learning to the incarceration and reentry space?
So since you have a really exciting experimental program, who pays for that? Because
Okay.
the government likes to pay for programs for argument's sake should be working.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
they might
right,
not be working. But
right. No, I think it's another good question. I think you just have to look at, all right, we're spending billions.
That's pretty
right?
clear.
Yeah, we're spending billions already. Is there a way to take a small fraction of that and apply it to an experimental model that we could rigorously evaluate and figure out, is this having an impact on that? If it doesn't, shut it down. I'm willing to live with that. I don't always believe that the prison industrial complex and the criminal justice industrial complex is willing to live with that. It's not working, so we need to shut it down. That more often than not, the answer is no, I'm not willing to do that. All right, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to put an idea out there, say, let's try it, and then if it works, great. If it doesn't work, let's go look for something else. But what's not acceptable to me is that we continue to spend all of this money and not only not help people, but we may actually be making the situation worse. That's a challenge that we need to address.
So this seems to make sense.
Okay.
And a funny story about that is I did a talk at Google, and when I kind of mapped out the whole recidivism problem, education seems to reduce recidivism. Everyone knows that, so let's do more of that. And some of the Googlers in the audience were like, I don't get it. They're like, if education works and recidivism recidivism drops after education, and it saves a lot of money also.
Mm-hmm.
So why aren't they doing it? They couldn't get their heads around it until somebody stood up in the audience and said, well, it's because it's the government, and the government isn't logical. And they're like, oh, well, that makes sense. So then how do we...
I think that's overly simplistic. I think government is a reflection of who we are as a people. And
we have the government we deserve.
Yeah, or something that approximates it.
Yeah.
Yes. So years ago, we said, no more Pell Grants. If you've committed a crime and you're in prison, why should we spend any more money on your education? We've spent a lot of money on you already, and we're spending tons more money while we got you in prison. There are a lot of people who haven't committed crimes, and what we're saying is, to those people who play by the rules, that they're not going to get something so that we can give it to you. And the public found that to be a very compelling argument. And so Congress took that step to eliminate Pell Grants for prisoners. We can now see...
and even that argument was flawed, because if a prisoner was getting the Pell Grant, it doesn't mean someone else isn't getting it.
Right.
It's every one of those need-based.
Right. But it's sort of I think it's a easy, sort of cheap shot argument that appeals to sort of a populist sentiment.
That was during the war on drugs, the tough on crime days.
Yeah.
Like, they conflated being tough on prisoners or being tough on crime as being tough on criminals.
Mm-hmm.
So they're being really tough on criminals, thinking that was going to affect the crime rate.
Yeah, there's something in American culture, I think, that says once you've committed a crime, you deserve to be punished forever. We take, at least in the abstract, right?
Yeah.
When we think about those people, all those thousands of people, millions of people behind bars right now, they've done something really bad, and they deserve what they're getting, and they deserve to keep getting it. Now, if it's somebody we know, if it's your uncle, your brother,
he's okay.
Yeah, he made a mistake.
Yeah. Isn't it so funny how second chances are personal?
Yeah. So, but at the level of kind of politics, there's a reason that politicians use those sound bites. It's because they work. They rile people up, and they say, "Damn right, that person needs to go away forever."
And nor is that even more reflective in social media posts. Like, somebody will post something, and you just see a whole stream of, this onslaught of terrible stuff.
Yeah. So there's definitely something in our culture that really likes the idea of the eye for the eye, the tooth for the tooth, and a very kind of, for lack of a better expression, kind of an Old Testament view of justice. There's not a lot of grace and forgiveness out there when it comes to, again, at the abstract level, there's not a lot of grace and forgiveness. And so, I think that's a huge barrier to any kind of anything new that you want to try to address crime and recidivism.
So how do you change the culture, the punitive culture?
That's
a bigger problem.
One thing that I know doesn't help is to have a lot of programs that fail.
Yeah.
Then people just say it's hopeless, that nothing works, and so we just need to stop doing everything. That's not my view. That's not what I want. Building prisons and keeping people locked up may be the most effective thing on offer. That's not an unreasonable conclusion to reach. I don't think it is. I think it's an incredible waste, not just of money, of dollars, but of lives. And so I think we have to keep trying. But it's not unreasonable for people to just walk away from the issue. What we can't do is just keep throwing money at this and expect the public's patience to be inexhaustible.
Yeah, we got to have some wins.
Yeah, got to have some wins. So we need to at least show that we're trying.
Yeah,
let's try this.
We're a storytelling culture, anyways. If you have a couple wins, a couple of stories, like maybe that can sway people.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you have a project in the works right now. What state are you?
Are
you playing in?
I work for a think tank, so we don't do projects. We come up we come up with ideas and suggest that other people take them on, and so that's sort of the next stage of this. We'll have a volume based on the work of our. So we've got this report coming out, which is this is the report on the discussion that happened, and then in the fall we're going to release a volume of essays written by the people on this working group that cover kind of these major topic areas that we've been talking about. And then I'll have a chapter in there that kind of lays out this alternative model. So once we get that done, I'm really hoping that we can interest a couple enterprising governors to invest in trying it, you know.
And how does that conversation happen? So you got this really great idea, and then how do you have a conversation with the governor, or any states come to you and say, hey, we all have this problem, but we'd like to try something. What do you have in mind?
So, I mean, I think every governor is looking at this issue. You know, it's a gigantic fiscal issue for states, is funding prisons. And they are desperate to find ways of emptying these jails in a way that protects public safety, that's consistent with public safety. So a couple of governors who want to try to reach out to people who really have taken on board this issue and see if they'd be willing to partner with us, get some foundations to help fund it, so that it's not just taxpayer money, but we've got some philanthropic money on the table as well.
Some risk capital, so to speak, to
Yeah.
keep this thing off.
Especially around the vouchers. I think that it's going to be hard to make the case, like with the Pell grants, that we're going to give somebody coming home from prison a voucher for $4,000 or $5,000. It's like, hey, I'd like that. My kid would like that. He hasn't, why? So maybe not make that taxpayer funded, but see if we could get a foundation to pay for that.
I mean, it kind of makes sense that the government should invest that, because on the back end they can save a lot more. They can save, what's the average cost incarcerated person?
Yeah, so the oldest argument in government is you got to spend money to save money. Everybody says that.
Yeah.
I
think
think
programs don't always work.
the programs usually don't work, and then I think getting the private money in there to say, look, this is a risk. We recognize it's a risk. We're trying it. We want the public to fund the stuff behind the wall, and we want private philanthropy to fund the stuff outside the wall. I think there are a lot of different ways of trying this, getting it done, and I think
get a pilot done first, and then
I think we need to have some enterprising governors and prison officials who say, yeah, this makes sense to us. We're willing to try it. We're willing to invest. The most important investment that a governor or a warden or the system can make is just leadership. It's like, it's so easy to just say, I've got too much to do already, and I don't want to take this on. But if you could get some motivated leaders involved in this, I think that would really help.
So it's about $4,000 or $5,000 per person.
That's about what we're spending in federal reentry programs right now. It's about $4,000 or $5,000 a head. Actually, we're spending about $8,000 per head. What I'm suggesting is you could probably do this more cheaply because you don't have so much overhead.
Okay. And then how many people would have to be in the program to have significant data?
Another good question, and I don't know the answer to it. We'd have to ask people who design research studies for a living to tell us, what are the numbers that we need to hit in order to have some statistical power.
And then, just as we were talking earlier, people are messy. So how do you?
Well, but I think that this approach actually takes into account the messiness, because it's
individualized per person.
Yeah, and the person themselves is really in charge of it, rather than an outside organization or the government or a nonprofit, whatever it is. It's really driven by the individual who is, like you and I, we're constantly calculating what we need to do next in order to get through our day, to finish our project, to do the next, to advance what we're trying to do. That we're relying on that. That's the beating heart of this, is that I think that there may be a significant number of people who have or can develop the capacity to make their own decisions and be more successful than we can be for them.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Sounds like an exciting program.
Yeah.
So what's your next steps on it?
So we got to finish this volume, get that published, and then we need to spend some time with some governors to see if we can get them to invest leadership resources. Maybe some taxpayer money is involved on some of the behind the wall activities. So
You got a couple of phone calls you're going to make.
yeah, I got a couple of phone calls, a lot of
you,
pleading, a
I
lot
don't
of
know-
begging.
I don't know if you want to disclose who you're talking to, but it sounds like you probably got.
No, I don't. I
couple
don't want
of-
to talk about
Yeah.
anybody that I might be thinking about. But there are some governors out there who, and almost all of them, really care about this, and some of them are invested in trying to do something different. So we'll be talking to them.
Very cool. Thanks so much for the chat.
Well, this has been amazing.
And we can just chat all day.
Yeah, we could.
You're
I'm sure we
fascinating.
can just keep going and going. I'll have you next time you're in Washington. I'll record a podcast with you and we'll put it on the EI site.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Are you hungry? You want to grab some lunch?
I do.
All right.
Okay.